Yeah, I mean, I could only cover a very small amount of the incidents that were misreported in East Aleppo. But even looking at it universally, Aleppo was misrepresented right from the beginning. From the beginning, it was described as just Aleppo, instead of explaining that, in fact, the terrorists had invaded in 2012 and had effectively cut Aleppo into two, with the majority, 1.5 million, in the Syrian government-held West Aleppo, and around 110,000 civilians in East Aleppo, and then on top of that, the various up to 50 brigades of extremist and militant factions dominated by Nusra Front. But one story that I'd particularly like to highlight was when I was in East Aleppo during the liberation in December 2016, and I was actually in the streets of the districts of East Aleppo as they were being liberated. And actually the UN and various media sources put out a story that the women in the areas were actually committing suicide out of fear of violation by the Syrian Arab Army. And then, of course, that the Syrian Arab Army was massacring civilians in the streets. I was walking those streets. There were no bodies. And in fact, when I spoke to civilians in the districts of East Aleppo, what they told me was, as they'd been trying to flee to get to the safety of West Aleppo and of Jabreen Registration Center, it was the terrorists themselves that had been firing on them and killing them. And one lady told me of a woman who was so starving, she went on her knees and just begged for food and begged to be allowed out, and they shot her in the mouth. So this was a situation where actually it was effectively a complete lie that was disseminated then by mainstream media without any investigation, without anybody on the ground inside Syria, and as usual relying upon extremist and terrorist affiliated citizen journalists or activists, however they call themselves.
You specifically investigated two cases, the Kafaya and the Fouad attacks, and as well the case of Omran Daqneesh. Could you tell us more about these two very interesting cases?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Ava Bartlett was in Aleppo very recently. She's still in Syria, but she actually interviewed Mohammed Daqneesh, the father, so she has way more detail than I have. But having read her reports and having spoken to Khaled Iskaf, who's a journalist on the ground who has been working on speaking to Mohammed Daqneesh for maybe 2 months now, we know that Mohammed Daqneesh has always consistently claimed that there were no planes in the sky on the night of the attack. They were known to be loyal to the Syrian government and to the Syrian army, and as such they were effectively targeted and threatened both then and now by the various terrorist and extremist factions. Omran Daqneesh was only lightly injured, but while his father was looking for his family amongst the rubble, they took the photograph, the famous iconic photograph that went viral, which of course was taken by Mahmoud Raslan, who we know to be now affiliated to Nour al-Zinki, the group that beheaded the 12-year-old Palestinian child Abdullah Isa, whose photograph, by the way, never went viral in the same way as Omran Daqneesh. We were then told that the family had relocated after liberation to West Aleppo, to Syrian government-held West Aleppo. Of course, mainstream media are trying to portray that the family is now being coerced into speaking to media and to Syrian and pro-Syrian media. This is complete nonsense. This has been denied completely by the family, by Mohammed Daqneesh. And as he pointed out, we have always been supporters of the Syrian government and the Syrian army. We have never supported the extremist factions inside East Aleppo. And one other very important point to make, which shows how, to what extent this entire image was staged, was the fact that he told us that originally another child had been chosen for the photograph, but when they saw Omran, who was smaller and cuter, they swapped the children. I mean, this is not the actions of a humanitarian organization. This is pure propaganda and exploitation of children to promote war, to kill more children.
And what about what happened in Rashideen?
Oh. This actually is one of the most shocking events of the war for me. We arrived 1 hour after the actual suicide truck had detonated, killing, we believe, 116 children. Those are the figures we were given by Faris Shahabi, and many adults also. We were told basically by all survivors, particularly by the mothers of the children, that when they entered Rashideen, they were deprived of food. They were kept locked on the buses for I think it was 2 days, until the 15th when the explosion happened. In the morning of the 15th, in the morning they arrived with the chips, bearing in mind that these children had been under full siege by Al-Sham and Nusra Front for 2 years, so deprived of food, deprived of humanitarian aid, deprived of water, deprived of fuel, deprived of all the essential basics for life. And suddenly these huge bags of chips appeared, and these children flooded off the buses to go and get them. Then they were locked back on the buses, and then we were told that 4 Turkish ambulances appeared only about 10-15 minutes before the explosion. We were told that Syria and Arab Red Crescent were told to leave, and we were told that at the last minute the children were allowed off. The van came with the chips again, so the children flooded off the buses, and then the detonation happened. So it was a deliberate luring and enticing of those children to their death. And then the extraordinary thing, and this was told to us by many of the survivors, but also by the bus drivers, was that immediately after the explosion, the mothers in particular were allowed off the buses for 10 minutes, around 10 minutes. So they didn't even have time to get to their children, but they told us that the white helmets and the various other cameramen that were there were filming them as if, and this was exactly quote unquote, as if they were staging that they were helping us. And then suddenly after 10 minutes they were pushed back onto the buses were locked, they were prevented from moving to a protected area at gunpoint, and at this point the children were piled into the back of trucks and were abducted. Basically they were driven away from the area, not to Aleppo, not to Al-Razi Hospital, which was maybe 10 minutes away, or to the waiting paramedic services, but to Turkey. And when we spoke to the mothers the day after, many of them had up to 10 members of their family missing. They didn't even know whether they were dead or alive. They had watched their own children mutilated, terrified, traumatized, wounded, being piled on top of dead children and basically taken away from them. This to me was just one of the most horrific atrocities. I can't even imagine how those mothers must have felt.